The tropical heat hit Emily like a warm embrace as she stepped out of Phuket International Airport. The air smelled of salt and spices, a mix of unfamiliar scents that should have been exciting, invigorating. But Emily felt none of that. Instead, there was a gnawing sense of dread in her chest, hidden beneath her polite smile. Michael, her husband of 10 years, walked briskly ahead of her, wheeling their shared suitcase with one hand and checking his phone with the other. It was always the phone. Emails, texts, calls. It didn't matter that they were on vacation. Work had become Michael's mistress long ago, and Emily, she realized, had grown tired of competing. "This trip is exactly what we need," Michael had said. "Weeks up is exactly what we need." Earlier, presenting the idea like it was a business proposal. Thailand is perfect. The beaches, the culture, anything could fix what had been broken for so long. The drive to the resort was picturesque. The coastline unfolded before them like a postcard, turquoise waters glittering under the sun, limestone cliffs rising dramatically from the sea, and colorful fishing boats bobbing gently on the waves. Michael barely looked up, his attention glued to his phone as he barked instructions to someone on the other end of the line. Emily pressed her forehead against the cool window, trying to lose herself in the view. She wanted to believe this trip could save them, but deep down, a part of her feared it was already too late. Their resort was a sprawling paradise nestled between the jungle and the ocean. The villa Michael had chosen was breathtaking, with floor-to-ceiling windows that opened to an infinity pool overlooking the sea. Inside, everything was immaculate. Crisp white linens, polished wooden floors, and vases filled with fresh orchids. Emily should have been thrilled. But as she stood on the balcony, looking out at the horizon, all she felt was empty. Michael, meanwhile, was already settling in. "This place is incredible," he said, glancing up from his phone for just a moment. "I told you it would be worth it." Emily forced a smile. "It's beautiful." That evening they had dinner at the resort's beachside restaurant, a table set just steps away from the waves. Emily wore a flowing sundress, her hair loose, hoping to rekindle a flicker of the connection they once had. Michael, however, was preoccupied. Between bites of grilled fish and sips of wine, he kept checking his phone, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Can't wait," Emily asked finally, her voice softer than she intended. Michael looked up, startled. "What? Your phone?" He hesitated, then sighed, setting the device face down on the table. "Sorry, I just want to make sure everything's running smoothly back home." Emily nodded, but the moment was already lost. She pushed her food around her plate, glancing at the couples at nearby tables. They were laughing, leaning close to one another, their hands brushing as they spoke. She couldn't remember the last time she and Michael had been like that. After dinner, Emily suggested a walk along the beach. Michael agreed, but he walked a few paces ahead, his hands shoved into his pockets. The moonlight cast a silver glow over the waves, and the cool sand felt soothing beneath Emily's feet, but the silence between them was deafening. Returned to the villa, Michael opened his laptop, muttering something about an early meeting. Emily climbed into bed alone, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily above her. The next morning, Michael was still asleep when Emily left the villa. She wandered through the resort's gardens, drawn to the scent of frangipani and the soft rustling of palm trees. Her aimless stroll led her to a sign advertising a cultural tour of the nearby town. On impulse, she signed up. The group gathered in the resort's lobby, where a tall man with an easy smile introduced himself as their guide. His name was Kiran, and he exuded a quiet confidence that immediately set the group at ease. His dark eyes sparkled as he spoke, weaving stories of Thai culture and history with humor and passion. Emily found herself drawn to him, laughing at his jokes and hanging on his every word. At the bustling market, Kieran handed her a small bracelet made of woven threads and tiny bells. "For luck," he said, his fingers brushing hers as he passed it to her. Emily hesitated, then slipped it onto her wrist. "Thank you," she said softly. "It suits you," Kieran replied, his gaze lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. When Emily returned to the villa that afternoon, Michael barely looked up from his laptop. "How was it?" he asked, his tone distracted. "It was nice," Emily replied, holding up her wrist. "I got this at the market." Michael glanced briefly at the bracelet. "Looks good," and with that he returned to his work. Emily sat on the balcony, staring out at the sea as she turned the bracelet around her wrist. She thought of Kieran's smile, the warmth in his eyes, and the way he had listened to her with genuine interest. For the first time in years, she felt seen. In the days that scene followed, Emily found herself joining more of Kieran's tours. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. Kieran asked her about her life back home, and Emily found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with Michael in years. She told him about her love of painting, a passion she had given up after their marriage, and her feelings of invisibility in her own home. "You deserve to be seen," Kieran said one afternoon as they stood at the edge of a waterfall, the roar of the water filling the silence between them. Emily looked at him, her heart pounding. "I don't know if I even know who I am anymore. Then maybe it's time to find out." That evening, Emily stood on the villa's balcony, the bracelet Kieran had given her catching the moonlight as she absently turned it around her wrist. The waves below were soothing, their steady rhythm a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. She could hear Michael in the next room, his voice sharp as he spoke on yet another work call. For years, she had tried to convince herself that this was enough, that Michael's dedication to his career was for their future, for their security. But now she wasn't so sure. The bracelet felt heavier than it should, its simple weave pulling her thoughts back to Kieran and the way he had looked at her earlier that day. "Emily, stop it," she whispered to herself, gripping the wooden railing until her knuckles turned white. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the memory of his voice, his touch, but it only made her chest tighten. She had spent so long suppressing her emotions, convincing herself that her unhappiness was a phase, that she was being selfish for wanting more. But Kieran's words kept echoing in her mind. "You deserve to be seen." "Do I?" she said aloud, her voice breaking. The night swallowed her question, offering no answers. Inside the villa, Michael ended his call and emerged from the bedroom. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Just thinking," Emily replied, not turning around. Michael walked over to her, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He leaned against the railing, staring out at the sea. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" It's beautiful here." "Yes," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael sipped his drink, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably. "Finally," he said, "I've been thinking too. About us." Emily's breath caught, but she kept her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know I haven't been present," he admitted. "Work's been crazy, and I guess I've let it take over more than it should." Emily turned to look at him, her heart pounding, the breakthrough she had been hoping for. But Michael's eyes were distant, his words rehearsed. "I want to make it up to you," he continued. "Let's plan something special tomorrow. Just the two of us." Emily forced a smile. That sounds nice, but deep down, she knew it wasn't enough. Michael's words felt like a bandage on a wound too deep to heal. She nodded anyway, letting the moment pass. The next morning, Michael kept his promise. He had arranged for a private boat tour of the nearby islands, complete with allure, snorkeling, and a gourmet lunch. Emily tried to enjoy herself, but her mind kept drifting to Kieran. She hated herself for it, for the way her thoughts betrayed her, even as Michael tried to be attentive. During lunch on a secluded beach, Michael poured her a glass of wine and raised his own in a toast. "To us," he said, his smile genuine for the first time in days. "To us," Emily echoed, clinking her glass against his. She wanted to feel something. Gratitude, hope, love. But the emotions wouldn't come. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. Michael was trying. He was here, wasn't he? And yet all she could think about was someone else. That night, Emily dreamed of Kieran. She woke with a start, her heart racing and her body tense. She glanced over at Michael, who was sleeping soundly beside her. The room felt stifling. Walls closing in. She slipped out of bed and onto the balcony, letting the cool night air wash over her. The ocean seemed darker tonight, its depths unknowable. She thought about the version of herself she had lost, the vibrant, creative woman who painted murals and danced in the rain. Where had she gone? And was it too late to find her again? The next day, Emily couldn't stay away. She signed up for another tour, knowing Kieran would be leading it. When she arrived, he greeted her with that same warm smile, his eyes lighting up as they met hers. "I was hoping you'd come," he said, softly, his voice just for her. Emily felt her pulse quicken. "I couldn't resist." The tour took them to a quiet village, far from the bustling tourist spots. Kieran showed them ancient temples, spoke of forgotten legends, and guided them through narrow streets lined with handmade crafts. But Emily barely registered the details. Her focus was on him, on the way his hand brushed hers when they walked too close, on the way his eyes lingered when he thought no one else was looking. At the end of the tour, as the group dispersed, Kieran stopped her. "Stay for a moment," he said. "I want to show you something." Emily hesitated, but followed him to a hidden path that led to a small, secluded garden. In the center was a stone bench surrounded by blooming jasmine. Kieran gestured for her to sit, then sat beside her, their knees almost touching. "This is my favorite place," he said. "It's quiet here. Peaceful. It's beautiful," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them charged. Finally, Kieran turned to her, his expression serious. "You seem restless, Emily, like there's something you're searching for." Emily looked away, her throat tightening. "I don't know what I'm looking for anymore." Kieran reached out, his fingers brushing hers. "Maybe you're looking for yourself." The words hit her like a wave, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She looked at him. Her eyes filling with tears. "I don't even know who that is." "Then let me help you find her," Kieran said softly. Emily felt the world tilt. She knew this was dangerous, that she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't take back. But when Kieran leaned closer, she didn't stop him. Their lips met, and the kiss was everything she had been missing. Passion, warmth, connection. When they pulled apart, Emily's heart was racing. "I shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "But you are," Kieran replied. "And that has to mean something." Emily returned to the villa late that evening, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She had replayed the kiss with Kieran in her head countless times during the walk back, her heart simultaneously racing with exhilaration and sinking with guilt. "Were you?" he asked casually, though there was an edge to his tone. "Out," Emily replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. "I needed some air." "For hours?" Michael stood, crossing his arms. "Emily, what's going on?" Her stomach twisted. She could feel the weight of his suspicion, the unspoken accusations hanging between them. "I just needed time to think," she said, her voice faltering. "About what?" Michael's brow furrowed as he stepped closer. "You've been distant this whole trip. Is there something you're not telling me?" Emily turned away, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter to steady herself. "It's nothing. I just feel overwhelmed." "Overwhelmed?" Michael's voice rose, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You think you're overwhelmed? Do you know how hard I've been working to give us this life? To give you this trip?" Emily spun around, her own anger flaring. "And what has that life cost us, Michael? You're never present. Even on this trip, you can't let go of work for more than a few hours." Michael's jaw tightened. "Don't turn this around on me. I've been trying, Emily, but I can't do everything alone. Neither can I." Emily's voice cracked as tears filled her eyes. "Do you even see me anymore, Michael? Do you even care about how I feel?" The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Behind him, Emily stood frozen, her chest heaving with the effort to hold back sobs. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. For years, she had been screaming internally, her needs and desires buried beneath layers of compromise and neglect. Now those feelings were erupting, and she didn't know how to contain them. The next morning, Michael was gone before she woke up, leaving a note on the kitchen counter. "Went for a run. Be back later." Emily stared at the words, the simplicity of them stinging in their indifference. She left the villa without eating, her feet carrying her to the beach where she had first met Kieran. He was there, as if he had been waiting for her. The moment their eyes met, a flood of relief washed over her. She didn't have to explain herself to him. With Kieran, there were no expectations, no judgment, only understanding. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said softly, his brow creasing with concern. "I didn't," Emily admitted, sitting beside him on the wooden boat where he leaned. "Michael and it's worse than I thought." Kieran reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "What happened?" Emily hesitated, her voice trembling as she spoke. "He knows something's wrong. I tried to explain, but it's like we're speaking different languages. I don't know how to fix it." Thoughtful. "Maybe it's about finding what you need, what makes you whole." Emily looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "And what if I don't know what that is?" "Then we figure it out together," Kieran replied, his gaze unwavering. "You deserve to be happy, Emily." His words unlocked something deep within her, a longing she had buried for so long it almost felt foreign. She leaned into him, their foreheads touching as she whispered, "I'm scared." "So am I," Kieran admitted. "But sometimes the best things come from taking a leap." The days that followed blurred together, a haze of stolen moments and secret encounters. Kieran showed Emily parts of Phuket she hadn't seen, the hidden beaches, the vibrant night markets, the quiet temples tucked away in the jungle. With him, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, her laughter coming easily, her burdens feeling lighter. With every kiss, every touch, the weight of her deception grew heavier. Michael wasn't blind. He noticed her absences, the way she avoided his questions, the way her smile no longer reached her eyes when she was with him. One evening he confronted her directly. "Who is he?" Michael demanded, his voice sharp as he stood in the doorway of the bedroom. Emily froze, her heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Emily." Michael's fists clenched at his sides. "I've seen the way you've been acting. You disappear for hours. You barely speak to me anymore. Who is he?" She swallowed hard, her mind racing for an answer, but the truth was written all over her face. Michael's expression twisted with pain. "How long has this been going on?" Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks. "Michael, I don't," he snapped, his voice breaking. Don't try to justify it. Just tell me the truth. Emily crumpled under the weight of his words, her sobs racking her body. I didn't mean for this to happen, she whispered. I was so lonely, Michael. I felt invisible. Michael staggered back as if her confession had physically struck him. And that's your excuse, to run off with someone else, while I've been here trying to keep us afloat? I needed something, Emily said desperately. I needed to feel alive. Michael stared at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You've destroyed us, Emily. Was it worth it? The next morning, Michael packed his things without a word. He left a simple note on the counter. Take care of yourself. Emily stood in the silence of the villa, the echo of the door slamming shut, still ringing in her ears. She looked down at the bracelet on her wrist, its bright colors now a painful reminder of what she had lost. As the days passed, Emily wandered the beach alone, her thoughts a constant storm of regret and longing. She hadn't seen Kieran since the confrontation, hadn't answered his calls or texts. She couldn't face him, not when the consequences of her actions were so raw. Sky bled together, a canvas of fiery orange and deep purple. She thought about the woman she used to be, the life she used to have, and the choices that had brought her here. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to sit with the weight of it all. The pain, the loss, the hope that still flickered somewhere deep within her. And as the stars began to appear, Emily whispered to the night, "What now?" Emily, what now? The ocean, as always, had no answer. The days stretched endlessly in the quiet emptiness of the villa. Emily had thought Michael's absence would bring her clarity, but instead, it left her adrift. Her thoughts spinning in circles. She wandered the resort aimlessly, avoiding the places she and Kieran had shared, yet unable to stop herself from glancing around, hoping to see him. But Kieran, too, had vanished. His absence felt like a punishment she didn't know she deserved. One evening, as the setting sun bathed the villa in gold, a knock echoed at the door. Emily hesitated, her heart leaping involuntarily. When she opened it, a small envelope lay on the ground, with no one in sight. Frowning, she picked it up and stepped back inside, closing the door behind her. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting inside unfamiliar. The note was simple, yet it sent a chill down her spine. The truth has a way of finding you. The message, was it from Michael, from Kieran, or someone else entirely? The words felt like an accusation, their ambiguity gnawing at her. She tucked the note away in her suitcase, trying to convince herself it was nothing. A prank, perhaps, but the unease stayed with her. The next morning, Emily decided she couldn't stay in the villa any longer. She rented a scooter from the resort and drove along the coast, the salty breeze whipping through her hair. The freedom of the open road was intoxicating, a brief escape from the weight of her guilt. She stopped at a small cafe perched on a cliffside, its view of the ocean stunning. As she sipped her coffee, a sense of being watched prickled at her neck. She turned, scanning the cafe, but saw nothing out of place. You seem distracted. Emily flinched at the familiar voice. Kieran stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. He asked. Emily nodded, her chest tightening as he sat across from her. I was beginning to think you were avoiding me, he said, his tone light but his eyes searching. I wasn't sure what to say, Emily admitted. Then let me say it, Kieran replied. I know things have been complicated. I didn't mean to make your life harder, Emily. Emily's throat tightened. You didn't make it harder. You made me feel alive again. But at what cost? Kieran's gaze was intense, and for a moment, Emily felt exposed. I never wanted to hurt you. Or him. Emily dropped her eyes, guilt crashing over her. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Kiran reached across the table. His hand hers. Maybe it's time to stop running and face the truth, whatever that is. Before Emily could respond, the cafe owner approached, placing a small folded note beside her coffee. "For you," he said simply. Emily frowned as she unfolded it, her pulse quickening. "You can't run from your mistakes forever." She looked. "Run from your mistakes forever?" Up. But the cafe owner was already walking away. Turning back to Kiran, she saw his brow furrowed in concern. "What is it?" he asked. Emily hesitated, then slipped the note into her bag. "Nothing. Just a reminder I wasn't expecting." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. The notes weighed on her mind, their cryptic messages gnawing at her nerves. Who could be sending them? Was Michael playing a cruel game, punishing her from afar? Or was someone else watching her? Someone who knew too much? The next morning she returned to the cafe, hoping to ask the owner about the note. But when she arrived, the place was closed, the chairs stacked neatly on the tables. A small handwritten sign read, "Closed for renovations." Emily's stomach churned. The timing felt too convenient, too deliberate. As she turned to leave, she spotted a figure in the distance, half hidden by the trees lining the road. She blinked. The figure was gone. The paranoia followed her back to the resort. She felt eyes on her wherever she went, though she never caught anyone staring directly. The staff seemed unusually polite, their smiles a little too knowing. When she asked if anyone had delivered the notes, they shrugged and shook their heads. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily returned to her villa to find the door slightly ajar, breath catching in her throat. Nothing appeared out of place. Her suitcase was still by the bed, the bracelet still on the nightstand. But on the dining table lay another envelope. She approached it cautiously, her hands trembling as she opened it. This note was different. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. "Stop before it's too late." The lights flickered as a gust of wind swept through the room. Emily spun around, her heart racing, but the villa was empty. She locked the door and pressed her back against it, struggling to catch her breath. Who was doing this, and why? Determined to get answers, Emily sought out Kiran the next day. She found him at the market, speaking with a vendor. When he saw her, his smile faded, replaced by concern. "Emily, what's wrong?" he asked, pulling her aside. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice urgent. "In private." Kiran led her to a quiet alley behind the market. "What's going on?" Emily showed him the notes, her hands shaking as she passed them to him. Kiran read them carefully, his expression darkening with each word. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" Emily asked. Kiran shook his head. "No, but this isn't random, Emily. Someone is trying to send a message. Do you think it's Michael?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kiran hesitated. "If it were him, wouldn't he confront you directly? This feels different." Emily's mind raced. What if someone saw us? What if— "Stop," Kiran said firmly, placing his hands on her shoulders. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone in this." But as he spoke, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and when she glanced over Kiran's shoulder, she thought she saw a shadow move. Emily's nights became restless, filled with vivid dreams and shadows that loomed larger with every passing day. She could no longer separate her fears from reality, and the notes felt like a tightening noose. Whoever was leaving them wasn't trying to scare her. They were delivering a warning. But what could she possibly be walking into? The following morning, Emily resolved to confront her growing paranoia head-on. She decided to visit the cafe owner who had delivered the second note. Perhaps he could provide some clarity. But when she arrived, she found the cafe's doors locked and the windows shuttered. A large, hastily painted sign on the door read, "Permanently closed." Her stomach churned as she stepped back, her eyes scanning the area. Across the street, a group of locals were talking animatedly, their eyes darting in her direction. When she turned to look at them, the conversation stopped abruptly, and they dispersed. A cold sweat broke out along her spine. This wasn't coincidence anymore. Emily spent the rest of the day wandering the resort grounds, her thoughts racing. Every time she saw a staff member, their polite smiles felt sinister, as if they knew something she didn't. When she returned to her villa that evening, she found another note waiting for her, placed neatly on her pillow. This time, it was a single sentence. "What you don't see can still hurt you." Her knees buckled, and she sat heavily on the edge of the bed, clutching the paper in her trembling hands. The messages were becoming more cryptic, more insidious. She glanced around the villa, her eyes darting to the windows and doors. How had someone gotten inside without her noticing? She thought about calling Michael, but she dismissed the idea almost immediately. He wouldn't believe her, and even if he did, what could he do from halfway across the world? Her thoughts turned to Kiran. He was the only one who seemed to understand, the only person she felt she could trust. But was she right to trust him? The question gnawed at her, its sharp edges cutting through her fragile sense of control. Emily decided to confront Kiran directly. She found him the next afternoon at the beach, helping a small group of tourists onto a long-tail boat. When he saw her, his expression shifted, a mix of relief and concern. "You've been avoiding me," he said as she approached. "I needed time to think," Emily replied, her voice firm. "And now I need answers." Kiran's brow furrowed. "Answers about what?" She handed him the latest note, watching his face carefully as he read it. His expression darkened, and he exhaled slowly. "This is getting serious, Emily." "Do you know who's doing this?" she asked bluntly. "Someone's been inside my villa. They know things about me, things they shouldn't." Kiran shook his head. "I swear I don't know, but I promise I'll help you figure it out." Emily studied him, searching for any hint of deceit, but his gaze remained steady. For now, she chose to believe him. "We need to be careful," she said. "Whoever's doing this, they're watching." That evening, as Emily walked back to her villa, she couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. She turned several times, scanning the darkened paths, but saw no one. When she reached her door, her breath caught. It was slightly ajar. Her first instinct was to run, but she forced herself to step inside. The villa was dark, the only light coming from the soft glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. She moved cautiously, her heart pounding, her ears straining for any sound. In the center of the dining table sat an object that hadn't been there before. Her bracelet. Emily froze, her chest tightening. She had left the bracelet on her nightstand that morning. Now it was here, placed deliberately where she couldn't miss it. Beneath it was another note. "Do you really know him?" Emily's mind raced. Was this about Kiran? Was someone trying to warn her? Or were they trying to turn her against him? She clutched the bracelet and backed away, her breath shallow as she scanned the room for any sign of an intruder. But the villa was empty, eerily, hauntingly empty. Emily confronted Kiran the next day, her hands trembling as she showed him the bracelet and the note. "Someone's trying to drive me crazy," she said, her voice cracking. "They're trying to make me doubt you." Kiran's jaw tightened. "And do you?" Emily hesitated. "I don't want to, but I need to know the truth. Is there something you're not telling me?" Kiran stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "Emily, I've been honest with you from the start, but whoever's doing this wants to tear us apart. They know how to play with your mind." "Why?" Emily demanded. What could they possibly gain? Kiran's silence was telling. He looked away, his hands clenched into fists. "Kiran!" Emily pressed. If you know something, you need to tell me. I can't keep walking blind into this. Finally, he spoke. There are people here, powerful people who don't like outsiders getting too close to locals, especially people like me. He hesitated, then added, and people like you. Emily's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? Kieran looked at her, his expression both pained and protective. All pointed to something bigger than her and Kieran. She couldn't sleep. She lay awake, replaying every interaction, every detail, searching for clues. When dawn broke, she made a decision. She needed to find out who was behind the notes and what they wanted. The morning sun spilled across the horizon as Emily stood on the balcony, her coffee untouched on the table beside her. The notes, the unease, the way Kieran had dodged her questions. All of it churned in her mind, dodged her questions. All of it churned in her mind. Like a storm she couldn't escape. She knew she couldn't keep living in this limbo. If Kieran wouldn't give her the answers, she would find them herself. After breakfast, Emily returned to the cafe that had mysteriously closed. She parked her rented scooter outside and walked the perimeter of the building. The windows were still shuttered, the doors padlocked. But there was something about the place that felt off. It was too perfect, as though it had been abandoned overnight with no trace of life left behind. A soft rustling sound caught her attention. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the trees lining the road. A man stood partially hidden in the foliage, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Emily's heart raced, obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, as she stepped toward him, but before she could call out, he disappeared into the forest. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the empty street. She sprinted to the spot where he had stood, but there was no sign of him. The only evidence of his presence was a small folded piece of paper pinned to a low-hanging branch. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. "Stop digging! You won't like what you find," the words were scrawled hastily. The ink smudged in places. Emily clutched the note, her mind racing. Someone was watching her, closer than she had imagined. Later that day, she decided to visit the resort manager, hoping to get more information about the cafe owner or the mysterious notes. The manager, a petite woman named Anya, greeted her warmly but stiffened slightly when Emily brought up the cafe. "It's unfortunate what happened," Anya said, her polished smile faltering. "The owner had to leave suddenly. Family emergency, I believe." Emily's eyes narrowed. "It seemed very sudden. Did he say where he was going?" Anya shook her head. "No, just that he had to close immediately. These things happen sometimes." Emily studied her, noting the slight tension in her posture and the way she avoided direct eye contact. "What about the staff? Did anyone else from the cafe say anything?" Anya's smile tightened. "I'm afraid I don't have any more details. Is there something else I can help you with?" Emily nodded slowly, realizing she wouldn't get anything more from her. "No, that's all. Thank you." As Emily walked away, she glanced over her shoulder and caught Anya speaking quickly into her phone, her face pale. A chill ran through Emily's body. Whatever was happening, the resort staff were involved, or at least knew more than they were letting on. That evening, Emily decided to confront Kieran again. She found him near the pier, helping load supplies onto a boat. When he saw her, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've been busy," he said lightly as she approached. "So have you," Emily replied, her tone sharp. "What aren't you telling me, Kieran?" Kieran's smile faded and he glanced around to make sure they were alone. "Not here," he said quietly. "Come with me." He led her to a small, secluded spot by the water, away from prying eyes. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the beach. Kieran leaned against a tree, his expression troubled. "Emily, you need to leave the resort," he said finally, his voice low. "Go back home. Forget about all of this." Emily stared at him, stunned. "What? Why? What's going on?" "It's not safe for you here," Kieran said, his gaze flickering toward the resort. "What do they want from me?" Kieran hesitated, then shook his head. It's not about you. It's about me. They've been watching us, Emily. They think I've told you things I shouldn't have. Told me what? Emily demanded. Kieran ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. This resort isn't what it seems. It's owned by people who deal in things they shouldn't. Money, power, control. They have their hands in everything. I used to work for them years ago, but I left, and they've never forgiven me for it. Emily's breath caught. And now they're targeting me because of you. Kieran nodded grimly. They're using you to get to me. The notes, the warnings. It's all to make you doubt me. To turn us against each other. Emily felt the ground shift beneath her. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I was trying to protect you, Kieran said, his voice heavy with regret. I thought if I kept you out of it, they'd leave you alone. But I was wrong. Emily's head spun. She thought back to the cafe owner, the cryptic notes, the feeling of cryptic notes, the feeling of being watched. It all made sense now, but it didn't make it any less terrifying. What do we do? She asked, her voice trembling. We leave, Kieran said firmly. Tonight, pack your things, and I'll meet you at the South Pier. There's a boat waiting. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily returned to the villa to pack. Shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, and every creak of the floorboards set her on edge. She had just zipped her suitcase when the lights flickered and went out. Panic surged through her as she fumbled for her phone. The flashlight illuminated the room in harsh white, but it only heightened her sense of vulnerability. She moved toward the door, her heart pounding, when she noticed something scrawled on the mirror in thick, dark letters. You've been warned, fell from her hands, the sound echoing in the silence. Someone had been in the villa while she was there. The realization sent a jolt of fear through her, but she forced herself to move. She grabbed her bag and bolted out the door, running toward the pier. At the pier, Kieran was waiting, his silhouette tense against the glow of the moonlight, blocking their path. Emily froze as the man from the forest stepped forward, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. You should have listened, he said, his voice cold. Now it's too late. Kieran stepped in front of Emily. It's too late. Stance protective. Stay behind me, he whispered. The man laughed, low and menacing. You can't run from them, Kieran. You know that. Emily's mind raced as the tension crackled in the air. Whoever this man was, he wasn't bluffing. And he wasn't alone. The man stood between them and the boat, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but his voice carried a quiet menace that made Emily's knees weak. Kieran didn't move, his body a solid wall between Emily and the stranger. The soft lapping of the waves against the pier was the only sound, amplifying the tension that hung thick in the air. I told you to leave her out of this, Kieran said, his voice low and dangerous. The man chuckled, shaking his head. You should know better than that. They don't leave loose ends, Kieran. And now she's a part of this. Caught, and her hands tightened around the strap of her bag. Who are you? She demanded, her voice trembling despite her best effort to sound strong. What do you want from me? The man turned his gaze to her, and for a moment, his eyes softened, not with kindness, but with something close to pity. This isn't about you, lady. It never was. You're collateral, a pawn in something much bigger than you. Kieran tensed, his fists clenched at his sides. Let her go. She has nothing to do with this. The man tilted his head, his smirk returning. You think I have that kind of power? I'm just here to deliver a message. If you keep running, it won't end well for either of you. What does that mean? Emily snapped, her fear bubbling over into anger. What are you talking about? The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. Emily's knees buckled. and she sank onto the pier, her breath coming in short gasps. "We have to go," Kieran said urgently, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. "Now?" Emily hesitated, her mind spinning. "Kieran, what aren't you telling me? Who are they? What did you do?" Kieran's jaw tightened and he glanced toward the boat, his urgency clear. The distance. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, the moon casting a silver path over the water. Kieran steered the boat with practiced ease, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. "Start talking," Emily demanded, her voice sharp despite the fear trembling beneath it. "I'm done with half-truths and warnings. If I'm putting my life on the line, I deserve to know why." Kieran sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the past was finally catching up to him. "It started years ago," he began. "I was working for the people who own the resort, handling logistics, smoothing over problems. At first, I didn't ask questions. The pay was good, and I was good at what I did. But then I started noticing things. Deals that didn't make sense, people disappearing." Emily's stomach churned, and she gripped the edge of her seat. "Disappearing? What do you mean?" Kieran hesitated, his grip tightening on the wheel. "Anyone who became a liability. Anyone who knew too much. They were dealt with, quietly." Emily's blood ran cold. "And you were part of this?" "I didn't know at first," Kieran said quickly, his voice filled with regret. "But when I found out I couldn't stay, I tried to leave quietly, to disappear. But you don't just walk away from people like them." Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. "And now they're coming after you?" "They've been coming after me for years," Kieran admitted. "But I didn't expect them to use you. That was my mistake." The weight of his words settled over Emily like a crushing tide. She had thought she was escaping her own troubles, her failing marriage, her search for meaning. Instead, she had stumbled into something far more dangerous. "What do they want now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To send a message," Kieran said grimly. "To make an example out of me." Emily's throat tightened. "And me?" Kieran's silence spoke volumes. The boat finally reached a small, secluded island. Kieran helped Emily onto the shore, his eyes scanning their surroundings with the wariness of someone who had been hunted for too long. The island was quiet, the dense jungle pressing in on all sides. "We'll be safe here for the night," Kieran said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Emily dropped her bag onto the sand, exhaustion and fear threatening to overwhelm her. "We're running from people who make people disappear, Kieran." "I know," Kieran said, his voice soft but firm. He stepped closer, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "I know this is terrifying, Emily, but I promise you, I'll get you out of this. I won't let anything happen to you." His words were meant to comfort her, but they only made her feel more exposed, more vulnerable. She pulled away, shaking her head. "I shouldn't have trusted you." Kieran's face fell, and for a moment, he looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But you're here now, and I won't let you face this alone." Emily turned away, her eyes scanning the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly, offering no escape. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if she would ever leave Thailand alive. As the night deepened, shadows stretched across the island. The distant sound of a boat engine broke the silence, and Emily froze, her heart racing. "They've found us," Kieran said, his voice tight. Emily's breath hitched as she turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" Kieran grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the dense jungle. "We run." Ross the cave entrance, illuminating the vines for a split second. Emily froze, her fingers digging into the stone. The beam lingered, and she felt Kieran's hand on her arm. steadying her. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the light moved on, and the voices began to fade. Emily let out a shaky breath, her knees buckling, as the adrenaline coursing through her finally began to subside. Said softly, though his voice carried little relief. For now, they stayed in the cave until dawn, neither of them daring to sleep. Emily leaned against the wall, her mind racing with questions and fears she didn't know how to voice. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the vines. Kieran finally spoke. "We can't keep running like this," he said, his tone heavy. "We need to end this." Emily looked at him, her exhaustion making her blunt. "How? How? They're everywhere, Kieran. They know everything. They have weaknesses," Kieran replied, his jaw tightening. "They rely on fear and secrecy to keep their power. If we can show the world what they're really doing, they'll lose their hold." Emily stared at him, the enormity of his words sinking in. "And how do we do that? They've already made it clear they're willing to kill to protect themselves." "I still have connections," Kieran said. "People who owe me favors. If we can get off this island, I can get in touch with them. But it's risky. Riskier than now." "But it's riskier than staying here?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with sarcasm. Kieran gave her a faint smile. "Fair point." Their journey off the island was fraught with danger. Kieran led Emily through hidden paths in the jungle, avoiding patrols and checkpoints. At one point, they were forced to wade through waist-deep water to bypass a guard post, the murky depths hiding sharp rocks and unseen creatures. By the time they reached the mainland, Emily was exhausted, her body aching from days of running and hiding. Kieran's contact, a grizzled fisherman named Somkai, waited for them at a remote dock. He greeted Kieran with a curt nod, his sharp eyes assessing Emily with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "This is her, Curia?" Somchai asked, jerking his head toward Emily. Kieran nodded. "She's with me," Somchai grunted, then gestured toward his boat. "Get on, we don't have much time." The boat ride was silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Emily clung to the edge of the boat, the salt spray stinging her skin. Kieran sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on her knee in a silent gesture of reassurance. When they finally reached the small coastal town where Kieran's contact awaited, Emily felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. But that hope was short-lived. As they stepped onto the dock, a familiar voice stopped them in their tracks. "I told you it was too late." Emily turned, her blood running cold. The man with the wide-brimmed hat stood at the end of the dock, flanked by two others. Their expressions were hard, their postures menacing. Kieran stepped in front of her, his body tense. "Let her go," he said. "This is between us." The man smirked. "Oh, Kieran, you still don't get it, do you? There's no getting out of this. Not for you. Not for her." Emily's mind raced as the men approached, her body frozen with fear. But as the first man reached for her, something inside her snapped. She grabbed the oar from Somchai's boat and swung it with all her strength, catching him off guard. Stumbled, cursing as Kieran lunged at the second man. Chaos erupted on the dock, the fight raw and desperate. Emily's heart pounded as she fought to keep up, every move fueled by adrenaline. Somewhere in the chaos, "Go!" But she couldn't leave him. Not like this. The dock erupted into chaos. The first man staggered back from Emily's swing, blood dripping from a cut above his eye. Kieran grappled with the second man, their struggle brutal and raw, while Somchai yelled in Thai, his voice lost in the noise. The third man lunged toward Emily, his movements quick and calculated. Her pulse roared in her ears as she swung the oar again, this time with less precision. He dodged easily, grabbing her wrist and wrenching the oar from her hands. Enough, he barked, his grip ironclad. Emily winced, trying to pull away, but he shoved her toward the end of the dock. Kiran saw her stumble and roared in anger, throwing his opponent to the ground. He lunged toward Emily, but the man in the wide-brimmed hat raised a gun, aiming it squarely at him. "Not another step," the man said, his voice eerily calm. Emily froze, her breath hitching. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling. "This doesn't have to end like this." The man glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You think you can change how this ends? You don't understand who you're dealing with." This was over before it even started. Considering Kieran's words, for a brief moment, Emily thought he might actually relent. But then his expression hardened, and he cocked the gun. "No one gets out clean." Before he could pull the trigger, a deafening sound rang out. A gunshot, but not from him. The man's body jerked as a bullet struck his shoulder, sending him reeling. Emily whipped around to see Somchai standing at the edge of the dock, an old revolver in his hands. "Get on the boat!" Somchai shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Kiran didn't hesitate. He grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the boat as the remaining men scrambled to recover. Emily's legs felt like jelly, but adrenaline pushed her forward, stumbled onto the boat, collapsing into the seat as Somchai fired another warning shot into the air. The engine roared to life, and the boat lurched forward, leaving the dock and their attackers behind. They didn't stop until they were miles offshore, the coastline barely a shadow in the distance. Emily sat huddled in the corner of the boat, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Kiran sat beside her, his breathing heavy, his face streaked with sweat and blood. "Are you okay?" "Nay. No," he asked, his voice hoarse. Emily nodded, though tears streamed silently down her cheeks. I thought we were going to die." Kiran reached for her hand, his grip firm and steady. "We didn't. We're still here." "But for how long?" Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Kiran didn't answer right away. He stared out at the open water, his jaw clenched. "No," he said finally, "but we'll figure it out. We'll stay ahead of them." Somchai interrupted, his tone gruff but not unkind. "You'll need to disappear for a while. I know a place, a fishing village far from here, quiet, off the grid." Emily's heart sank. Disappear. Leave everything behind. The weight of it pressed down on her like a stone. "This isn't the life I wanted," she isn't the life I want, murmured. "I know," Kiran said softly, "but it's the life we have now." Days turned into weeks as Emily and Kiran settled into the small fishing village Somchai had arranged for them. The people there were kind but kept their distance, sensing the danger that lingered around the couple. Emily spent her days helping the local women mend fishing nets, her nights sleepless as she replayed the events that had brought her here. Survival. But beneath their fragile happiness lay the unspoken truth. They were still running. One evening, as they sat on the beach watching the sunset, Emily finally broke the silence. "Do you think we'll ever be free of them?" Kiran hesitated, then wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I don't know, but I do know I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Emily leaned into him, her heart aching with the weight of their reality. She had left everything with the weight of their reality behind, her old life, her husband, her sense of security. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. But she knew one thing. She couldn't go back as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in fiery hues. Emily made a silent vow. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it. She would fight for the chance to rebuild, to find herself in the fragments of her shattered life. But in the shadows of the jungle behind them, unseen eyes watched, waiting for the right moment to strike.